Hello there, and good morning to everyone. Happy Easter. This morning we're going to do a little bit of exploration, a little bit of Easter egg hunting, and I'll get us started down the path here, and then I'll leave the rest of it up to you to do some further exploring and discovering at home. I want to start with a little bit of a Google search here this morning. I want to look at Jesus and resurrection. Look at Jesus and resurrection here. And when we look at the images here that come up in the search, we see some images that are probably not at all surprising to you. We see images of Jesus coming out of the tomb, um, and he's by himself in a lot of these pictures. Maybe sometimes there are some angels there bearing witness to Jesus coming out of the tomb, but he's very triumphant, very regal, very majestic. Um, and depending on which era you look, these are all kind of recent depictions of it. But if you go further back in church history, you'll see pretty much the same thing. That as Jesus comes out of the tomb, he looks very powerful, very triumphant, kind of like he's just won an Olympic medal and that sort of thing. Sometimes there are some witnesses to Jesus coming out of the tomb, sometimes not, but it is this solo image of Jesus coming out of the tomb like that. And that is almost, you might be asking, why would I even point that out? Because it's pretty obvious. And if it's obvious to you that the resurrection means Jesus coming out of the tomb by himself, all that means is that you are probably a Western Christian. And that's part of the point that I want to make this morning is that we have inherited this very important tradition, this very important depiction and imagery of Jesus coming out of the tomb on Easter morning, like this. Um, I want to show you what an Eastern Christian might think of when they are depicting, envisioning the resurrection. And that is by adding the simple word Eastern, not Easter, but Eastern to our search here. And when we search Jesus resurrection Eastern, now we're looking at images from the Eastern tradition of Christianity. And you will notice right away that something very different is going on here. That in the Eastern depiction and artwork and iconography of the resurrection, we have something else happening here. And that is that as Jesus comes out of the tomb, we have a representation of him doing something other than just exiting a tomb. We see him very often standing over the gates of Hades, um, the place of the dead. And the gates of Hades are often in a cross shape or an X shape. And sometimes you might even see Hades underfoot. Maybe sometimes he'll even be bound. And that's symbolic of Jesus, obviously restricting Hades, the keeper of the dead, so that he can do something. And if you see only two people in these pictures, it will be Adam and Eve. You see Jesus is pulling Adam and Eve up out of the grave here in this resurrection scene. What's happening is that Jesus, in this upward movement here with his clothes flowing upward, often carrying some sort of small symbolic cross to remind us of the crucifixion. But the emphasis in this artwork is that he is pulling Adam and Eve, the representatives of humanity, up out of the graves with him. And if there are other people in the picture, we'll often have um, imagery of royalty. King David and King Solomon will often be part of this artwork. Maybe there'll be some saints and prophets and martyrs depicted along with Jesus as well. But this is standard imagery for Eastern artwork and tradition as far as the resurrection is concerned. When we think about the resurrection of Christ in Eastern Christianity, we draw it like this. We put Jesus over the gates of Hades. Maybe there'll be some locks and bolts and shackles that are broken underneath the gates of Hades. And we're taking Adam and Eve by the hand and pulling them up out of the tombs. And royalty and Old Testament saints and martyrs, another classic Eastern depiction of Easter, same thing. Jesus and the martyrs and that sort of thing coming here. Uh, Here's an article. I want to encourage you to maybe look at some of the articles associated with these art pieces of art as well. They'll be quite informative. Here's a book by the Crossons, which I think is really helpful in exploring this whole concept a little bit more. And what Crossan, John Dominic Crossan and his wife, Sarah Sexton Crossan, argue for is that when we're talking about Easter, we have a very important part of Easter and the Easter tradition and the art of Easter that has been lost on the Western tradition. And that is this depiction of the resurrection as the general resurrection, as the corporate resurrection. That the point and purpose and function of the resurrection is not just about Jesus as coming out of the tomb solo, although that's an important part of it, but it also has to do with the theology of raising up and rescuing and redeeming all of humanity from the grave. And that's the depiction that we get and that we can appreciate from the East. And as far as the history goes and how this happened, that there's such a difference between Eastern artwork and Western artwork in the way that we depict and imagine the resurrection. Well, there's a long story and a long history there. I encourage you to maybe check that out on your own or look up that book by the Crossons. They do a good job of exploring and explaining that. But what I want you to do is just be aware of this difference here, that there is another half of Easter that we often miss out on in the West when we talk about Easter and about the resurrection. And the point that Crossan makes, the point that I think a lot of scholars and theologians would want to make, is that it's important for us to maintain both of those halves. That Easter is most certainly about Jesus coming out of the tomb, triumphant, regal, majestic, that he is the conqueror, but we should also be aware of and incorporate into our understanding and appreciation of Easter and our theology of Easter this concept of the function of Easter, what it means. And I think the Eastern Church really captures that much better than the Western Church does. That Easter is about this picture right here, and all of the other pictures that we inherit from the Eastern tradition. I want to encourage you this morning to reflect on these things, to think on them on your own, and take some time to read through the text of 1 Corinthians 15. Now, that's a longer text, and it'll take several minutes for you to read through that whole thing. Maybe we can get a jump start here during church this morning. But reading through the great text on the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, I want to encourage you to do that on your own or maybe as a group in your household, and really ask the question, which, if Paul were drawing the resurrection, if Paul had a chance to draw the resurrection, which image would he probably appreciate more? Something more in the Western tradition, something more in the Eastern tradition, or maybe would he want to capture both of those together somehow?